Hey folks, Jack from Moonshift Audio here. After last week's production video, this video is going to take you through the entire mixdown from my recent collaboration with Tokyo-based artist Kinoco. Need to know. I've been working with Kinoco on and off for a couple of years now, and he's kindly allowed me to show you under the hood of this track. For a lot of these tutorial videos, I have to actually make a sketch of the track to show you how to get that sound, and for time reasons, I can't always go to the same level of detail and polish that I put into a commercial release. So it's a real treat to be able to show you this project, which ended up with over 150 channels when you count the effects tracks and buses. It sounds like this.
Always waiting. Slip away, break the line of sight. Taillights hanging in the air tonight. This is real. Take the wheel. Daylight, take flight. Away from this life. It's out there somewhere. Give it one more try. Do you ever feel like you keep running from your ghost? Tomorrow.
There's a link to the full release in the description of this video, and I'd also highly recommend checking out some of Kinoco's other music. I think he's really smashing it at the moment. If you're working on your mixing skills and you're learning here on YouTube, you might have found that you reach a certain point and then the tutorials just can't take you much further. I found that when I was learning, there was no substitute for hearing what is needed for the actual audio that you're working on. If you're interested in hearing how a pro might treat your audio, then check out my Mix Exploder service, where I give your track a professional mix here in the studio. Then I make you a personalized video just like this one, where I go through every plugin on every track and I show you exactly what I did to get you that pro sound. You can learn more about the Mix Exploder from the link in the description, but for now let's jump into Cubase and look at this mixdown.
Alright, here we are in Cubase, and as I often do, I'm going to start looking at this mix by checking out the drums. And what I'm actually going to do here is something that I would do in a lot of mixes, which is to just skip to the busiest part of the track. So this is a part where all of the drum elements are going to be present, so it just means that I can hear the sort of overall balance. I've got the vocals muted for now. I'm just going to look at the main instruments first, and we'll get onto the vocals later because there's quite a lot going on there. So this is the sort of final pre-chorus. And if I just solo the drums. So I've done two videos already that sort of lead up to this one. One where I looked at the main drum sound, the kick and snare, and another one where I've showed you how to make those sort of classic 80s toms. And as those are pretty much the exact drums from this project, I'm just going to look at the additional drums that I didn't have in that. So the main parts actually are these percussion elements. Now I've got this shaker, and you can see here the only plugin I've got on that channel is a very simple high shelf, giving us 5 dBs at about 11k, and you'll probably find a very similar thing on the tambourine. In fact, no, that's literally just a roll-off. On the sort of tambourine roll, which sounds like this, again, just one simple thing, and that's a pretty big boost. That's a 10 dB boost, but if we hear this without, just adding a little bit of a shimmer on there. And if we just listen to the drum mix again, I'm going to bypass these EQs. And now I'll bring them in again. You can hear that shaker coming out. Tambourine is just thinning out the low end. And now you can hear that tambourine roll coming out. And that's pretty much it in terms of processing there. You can do so much with just a fader. Again, these crash cymbals, which we can hear on their own. Nothing at all on those processing wise. They are sending to the drum reverb. We can check that out. It's an RMX16 on a drum hall setting. No additional processing on that either. The hi-hats, we're just rolling off most of the lows. I'm putting a bit of a high shelf on again if I bypass that EQ. And here there's a lot of mud there actually. And particularly because these are going to a fair bit of reverb. Pulling out that low end, you can hear there's a real kind of like muddy wash coming off that reverb tail. We can have a quick look at the drum bus. I sent the kicks to their own bus, and all I've got on there is a standard clip, and you can see here I'm just taking off the very tops of those if I bypass it. Not really any noticeable change in sound, but we are just going to get a little bit of extra headroom out of that. And then all of the drums, including the kicks, then come to my drum bus. And on there, I've got an iHeart NY for some parallel compression if I bypass that. Just adding a subtle bit of extra energy. From there we go into a pull tech, which is just adding some high end to the whole drum part. I think this is a slightly later addition in the mix. I decided that the drums in general could just do with a bit of high end energy. So I pulled this up, got the high frequency here at 12K, and I'm just doing 3.5 dBs. So if we hear that without, and I'll bring it in. Particularly on the cymbals, the hi-hats. If we listen to that in the context of the mix, just helps to give it that sort of nice sparkle, and there'll be a bit of saturation coming from that as well. There's a gain plugin here that I'm just using as a way of automating the volume without losing control of the fader. Could be doing that with a VCA, but I quite like using a gain plugin, and that's just to give it a boost as we come into the second verse. We can check out the bass now. I did look at this in the production video last week, and it hasn't changed very much, but I will go a little bit more in depth into how this was actually mixed. So again, we can listen at the busy section. This time we'll check out the sort of final chorus, the first half of it. So you can see here, I've got a Pro C, which is helping just to smooth out the sort of coming and going that we get a bit from this bass patch. So if I bypass this, you can hear that there's just a little bit of inconsistency in the low end of this. Really quite difficult to hear if you're not listening on decent headphones or speakers. If I bring the compressor in, you can see how the amount of compression is changing as the note sustains. And it's just helping to hold it, lock it together, make it a bit more solid as the sort of backbone of the track. EQ wise, rolling off some of the very, very lows. And some of the mud. If I bypass that, you can hear it just suddenly gets quite sort of boomy. This second Pro C is sidechained from the kick drum. So if I come down and bring the kicks back in, now, there's a real trend at the moment to use Sidechain Soothe for everything. You know, it's like this really clever, transparent way of ducking things out the way of other things. But actually, I think in a lot of cases, you're better off using a straight sidechain because you actually hear, you sort of feel that ducking, and that can be a really powerful part of what gives energy and movement and life and breath to your mix. I almost feel like we're at a time at the moment where people are afraid to do anything bold. It's almost like every move you make has to be transparent. What's the most transparent compressor? What's the most transparent EQ? I don't want it to sound like it's compressed. I don't want it to sound like it's EQ'd. Well, I love the sound of some compressors. I love the sound of a bold EQ move. And sometimes I really love the sound of an audible ducking in the bass. And in this track, I think it really works. Let's just listen to that in the context of the mix. Now that's going to be buying us some headroom as well, which is no bad thing. And it's quite subtle, but I think you do actually feel that little duck on the bass there. The bass comes to a bass bus where I'm doing some more EQ work. This is bringing together a sine wave sub, which we looked at last week, and the intro bass. And this cut here is to make room for the kick a little bit more, give us more headroom. This is just scooping out some more of the mud, if I turn that off. It's just unnecessary sort of low mid. And then this is just to compensate. I was pulling out more of the sort of 500 Hertz region than I would have liked. And I've also got a sidechain Soothe, which is coming from the kicks. Now, this is going to be hitting the bass after that sidechain ducking, and this one is to give us that transparent headroom. I struck a balance in this track using a normal sidechain and then the sidechain Soothe, so this is only going to be ducking the frequencies where I've told it to, i.e. the lowest. Can hear how much more of the low end we hear from that kick when this is engaged. But we do still get that nice audible ducking from the sidechain, so we're kind of getting the best of both worlds there. The last plugin on the chain is just this gain, and literally all that is doing is a fade out on the last note of the track. It was just ending a bit abruptly. Okay, so with the drums and the bass done, we can take a look at the synths. Now we've got this intro synth, which we looked at before. I'm just rolling off the very subs here, so it doesn't interfere too much with the bass and the kick down there, and taking a little bit of that kind of like presence 3K out, which might interfere with the vocal. And there's the flanger that we looked at in the production video last week. And that's literally it for the whole track on that synth. We next get these big synth chords, which are panned left and right. All I'm doing on that is rolling off the lows. There's no compression or anything like that. On the right hand side, almost exactly the same. And there's that lovely, lovely width that we get with both of them together. So at this stage, as far as the backing track goes, we've actually looked at everything. We've got the drums, the bass, and the synths. And so now we're on to the first chorus, which is that really lovely stripped down section. And for the centrally panned chords that sound like this, you can hear I'm actually really scooping a lot out. All of the low end is taken out, and a lot of the upper mids. This is if I bypass that band. And the reason for doing that is because they're sitting behind this DX7. Now, wasn't doing much to that. I am scooping out some of the lows and widening the sound. This is on the background synth, the sort of brassy synth. without that band, it's kind of getting in the way of the lovely sort of plucky, malletty kind of sound that those DX7 keys have. As that chorus progresses, we bring in this arpeggiator, which I'm doing a pretty aggressive boost here. So this is something that I've mentioned in another video, but I think it's really important not to be afraid of doing big boosts. And I think this is a problem associated with people mixing with their eyes. We've got these amazing digital EQs now, like the Fab Filter ones, built-in ones to Ableton, Logic, and Frequency and Cubase is another great option. And whilst it's amazing to be able to see what we're doing visually represented, I think it makes us a bit scared of sort of putting a huge, great boost in. Whereas sometimes that's what's going to get you a really great sound. Now, if you were mixing it on a console, you would probably just reach out, grab the knob, and give it a twist. And you'd be listening, and you'd twist it until it sounds good. And I very much doubt many people are going to then go and look at the desk and be like, oh my goodness, I put in 10 dBs there. That can't be right. If it sounds good, it's what you need. So if we take a look at this EQ, you'll see what I mean. I put in a 10 dB boost at 9K, which I think a lot of people might listen to that and just be like, what? But let's hear it with and without. So this is without the EQ. And I'll bring it in. So it starts to sound very plucky and thin. But what about if we listen to this in the context of the mix? And I'll just bypass that EQ again. So what that sound is giving us is almost becomes a sort of percussive element. It's sitting right up there just beneath the hi-hats and tambourines and the higher sort of percussion. And it's just giving this nice high-end boost. And that's not going to be interfering too much with the vocal or other elements. It's another good demonstration of why you shouldn't EQ things in solo. Because I would say, listening to that, if someone said, right, here's my sound, and this is what I want to do to it, you might be like, oh, it's just lost all its body. But in the mix, that's what the mix wants. We're getting into the second verse now. And we've got this copy of that same up, bringing in that EQ. This helps it come through a little bit more in the upper register. And now we get to the section where the guitars are coming in. So this EQ has been bypassed so far through this video. And you can hear I'm really thinning it out. But in the mix, if I undo that EQ, just way too much build up there. It's interfering with the bass and some of those chords. The whole thing's super muddy. And I just wanted that right in the background. So these big cuts, that's 20 dB cut there. Really help. We can check out the other guitar part. And I'm doing some not quite such extreme work, but I am taking 10 dBs out at 300 Hz. Again, pulling out all the lows there. And this is with that EQ engaged. Just helps to push it back in the mix, thin it out a bit. And that's going to be particularly desirable when we hear the vocal. We're now into the next pre-chorus. Again, all of these elements we've looked at already, so I'm not going to jump backwards. Guitar is the last thing really in this mix before we get to the vocals. here, again pulling out the low end of those. So we're getting into the last pre-chorus now, and we've got this nice arpeggiated guitar line with a pretty big cut in the low mids. Which is just a little bit too much. There's also some gain automation that I've put on this, but we'll come back to that at the end. For now, there is another strum here, and this sound I actually had to do a reasonable amount of work on. So I'm thinning it all out a lot, taking out some harshness. But I was also hearing there's just some slightly unpleasant resonances in the low mids. So I pulled up a Soothe here. Just to soften that. And it has sucked a bit of the life out of it, to be honest. But this is way in the background, this sound. I don't need it to be at the front. I almost don't want it to be too dynamic. If we listen to that in the context of the mix. It's really not a big part of the production. If I mute it, it's literally just there to add just a little bit of extra depth, a little bit of extra flavour. We're into the final chorus now, and all the synths are back in, and we've got one more guitar part here. Heavily chorused. And this time, I'm actually pulling out quite a lot of the upper mids and the highs. And if we listen to that in the mix, I'll just turn this off. Just helps to push it back, get it out of the way. But it is missing when you mute it. Really like having elements in a production and in a mix that you almost don't miss them until they're gone. It's just a way of filling things out in a gentle and subtle way and keeping things interesting. All these guitars are going to a guitar reverb, which has just got a Bright Hall preset from Valhalla, and I'm taking out all the lows and actually putting a little bit of high end in. If you want to hear that without. Just helps to give that reverb the frequency character that supports the overall balance. We did look at the guitar solo in last week's video, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, though it is a beautiful thing. You can see here, literally the only processing is rolling off the very, very lows and taking a tiny little bit of the mud out. I am also using a Soothe here, and this is actually sidechained from the snare. Now, if I just bypass this, I wasn't completely happy with how the snare was coming through in this final section where it's very busy, particularly the second half of the solo where it gets even more busy. So if I bring this in, just hear a little bit of the high end of the snare coming through. It's really subtle, but everything helps when you've got a mix as busy as this one gets. Okay, that's the backing track. I think it's time to take a look at the vocals. Now, there's quite a lot going on with this vocal chain. It's fairly comprehensive. So we'll listen to this in solo, just for the purposes of this tutorial. And I'm going to bypass all the effects and we'll bring them in one at a time. So here's the vocal completely dry. I'll bypass the sends as well.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
It's very nicely recorded. Thanks very much for that, Kinoco. There's perhaps just a little bit of low end build up there, but it's very, very dry, it's very clean, and it's very, very quiet. So the first thing I've done, classic move, big cut, 30 dBs at 50 Hertz. So that's the subs we're rolling off there. And I'm taking 7 dBs out of the mud, that sort of 450, 500 Hertz region. So if I bring in this EQ,
ready to leave it all behind in a city. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
in here, we're really scooping out some of those unwanted sort of resonances down in the low end. A lot of people might tell you that it's a good idea to EQ after you've compressed, because otherwise you're sort of squashing the frequency balance back down again with your compressors. But when it comes to cleaning up some mud and rolling off low end, I think that's a really good thing to do before you go into any compression, because otherwise those kind of frequencies that you don't actually want to hear in your finished vocal are going to be present going into the compressor, and they're going to be pushing into the detection circuit and making it work harder than it necessarily needs to. Now, particularly with a clean vocal like this, I feel like a game of inches approach works really well, and I don't want anything in this chain working harder than it has to. And we can see what that's doing by pulling up our next plugin, which is the Blue Stripe 1176 from Universal Audio, which I absolutely love. And if we see what that's doing,
swaying in the 4 a.m. light,
just catching the peaks,
ready to leave it
couple of dB gain reduction tops on that. Perhaps if we listen to this line here, I can see in the waveform that it's slightly louder, so we'll probably get, yeah, so we're tickling 3 dBs.
Hand out trying to hedge a ride.
But if I bypass that Pro Q3 where we're scooping out a little bit of the mud and rolling off the subs, see what this compressor's doing now.
Hand out trying to hedge a ride.
There you go.
Hand out trying to.
I can actually hear that compressor working now, particularly on that initial hand out word. It's almost on the edge of getting a bit pumpy. And that is a great use case for EQing before you start anything else in your chain. Corrective, subtractive EQing at least. Let's go back to the start of the track and we can pull up our next compressor. This Blue Stripe 1176 into Silverface LA2A combo for me is just pop vocal magic. It almost always works, although you don't want to get into a kind of paint by numbers game, so it's important to actually listen to make sure that the plugins that you're choosing really do serve your mix. But with the 1176 catching the peaks, we can drive into this one, and it should be compressing quite consistently.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
And I'll bypass that.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave it all behind
And
in
enable
a
it.
city. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
Getting perhaps a tiny bit of a volume boost out of that, but you can hear the consistency is really there now. And what we're also getting is some very subtle kind of high-end saturation that is the real magic for this compressor. Just listen to the high end, the sort of air on the vocal.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m.
And if
light.
I enable it,
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
and bypass it,
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
it's adding clarity and brightness, but without harshness. Speaking of clarity and brightness, we're next going into a pull tech, and this is just adding a little bit more high end. You can see I've got the high frequency set at 8K, and I'm just pushing into that by 2 dB.
Swaying in
Nothing
the
else
4
going on
a.m.
here.
light.
So listen to the top end when I enable this.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
You can hear It's a much more noticeable change in the high end there. But it is only 2 dBs. We're not going crazy here. Of course, this plugin will also be adding saturation. It's what these analog modeling plugins sell themselves on. And in this case, I really like it. More EQ now. And we're on to my old favourite, the Marg EQ4. This is from Plugin Alliance. I'm putting 1.5 dB shelf in at 2.5K, which is just overall brightness. But I'm just going to pull that back to 0 for now. And we'll listen to the air band, which is what this EQ is famous for. I've turned it up to 40K, which is obviously way outside the range of human hearing. And I'm putting 5 dBs in. So this is without.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
And now I'm bringing it in.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Just adding that real sheen on there. If I put this all the way up,
swaying in the 4 a.m. light,
there you can really hear.
Ready to leave it all behind.
I mean, that's obviously way overcooked.
City. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
You can hear where it's
Ready
acting.
To leave it all behind.
And if I now put this,
swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
back in, obviously these bands are going to interact because everything above 2.5K is going up by 1.5 dB. And then, as well as that, we're putting 5 dBs in at 40K. So it's an extra 1.5 dB there.
Ready to leave it all behind.
And that's now starting to sound really bright. So just so we can get a bit of context, I'm going to bring in the rest of the mix.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city. Lost to memory. Hand out trying to hitch a ride.
So that's a real sparkly pop vocal now. But it will be somewhat softened when we bring in the reverbs. But for now, let's just get through the rest of this chain. So, Pro Q3, pulling out just a tiny bit more mud.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
And I'm using a dynamic band here.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Just to
swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
Pull a tiny bit more.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Of the low end out.
Swaying in the 4 a.m.
Because there was some sort of low frequency build up going on with this track. Now getting into saturation land with soft tube harmonics on a vocal thicken preset.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Without.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Just helping that to cut through, and actually I can hear that working more on the mids than I can on the top end. But then into fresh air. If you watch my recent video on this, you'll know that I have mixed feelings about this plugin, but here I think it was working, and you can see here I'm doing nothing on the highs and 6% on the lows.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
Yeah, so we're just getting that little bit of extra sort of excitement and sparkle there. We're now using a Soothe, and this I'm using as a de-esser. The preset that I've tweaked is DS, and that's that. And I really love Soothe as a de-esser. I think it's the most transparent that I've found.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Swaying in the 4 a.m.
Just not so much like softening the S's overall. Like, because this vocal was so nicely recorded, the S's aren't harsh. And that is a real compliment to the way that Kinoco recorded this, because after so many plugins which are all adding saturation, we're getting saturation from both compressors, we're getting saturation from the pull tech, we're getting saturation from the harmonics processor, and we're getting saturation from fresh air. So there's 5 stages in this process which are all going to be saturating, and the S's are still pretty clean. I think if this had been recorded on a cheap mic at this point, those S's would be drilling into my eardrums. They are a little bit harsh, which is why we're using the Soothe here, but I'm not having to work too hard. So thanks, Kinoco. We got a few sends from this vocal. We're going to a few soothes, which we can look at later, but we've also got some effects. So I'll bring them in one by one. First of all, we've got a reverb.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
We're doing the classic Abbey Road trick, where we're pulling out the lows and the highs of that vocal before we go into the reverb, which in this case is an RMX 16, and a vocal ambience preset. Really has that 80s characteristic, that reverb. And after that, I'm going to throw on this stereo enhancer.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Actually pulling this slightly narrower. We've got a lot of quite wide elements in this track. And so keeping the vocal reverb, I didn't want to make it completely mono because this isn't a 70s production, but pulling that in a bit helps to focus the center of the track. We're also sending from that vocal to a slapback delay. And there's quite a few plugins on this. So we're doing this sort of classic scoop out the lows and the highs to stop this delay, or it's almost like a kind of reverb really, from becoming too muddy or sparkly. I'll look at this de-esser in a minute, but we're going into another RMX 16 on a slapback preset, and it sounds like this.
Behind in a city, swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
Now that's your 80s character right there. It's quite diffuse. It's not just like having a delay, but it's a short decay reverb with a little bit of a pre-delay. And I just wanted to take some of the S's out of this. So I'm probably working this pretty hard, I reckon, this de-esser.
In the 4 a.m. light, swaying in the 4 a.m. light, swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
You can hear, if you're not careful, those kind of like double S's and double T's that you can get with a short delay on a vocal can become quite distracting. So by de-essing just the feed going into the delay unit or the reverb unit, you can keep things clear and uncluttered. In this case, with the slapback, I'm actually making this fully mono. I'm using this free BX Solo plugin from Brainworks, and I'm pulling the width down to 0, or mono if you like. So we'll hear that. This was what it bypassed.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
Quite wide.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
And just like we were doing with the reverb, we're just trying to pull that vocal a little bit more into the center, and we'll let the instrumental inhabit the sides of the mix. So we got the reverb and the delay now.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city, swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
We've also got a delay, and I played around with an Echo Boy, but I ended up using Baby Comeback, which is a free plugin from Baby Audio, and the reason I went for this one is because I wanted to use the ducker. I've got a video which is specifically about how to make use of ducking when it comes to your reverb and delay sends, to duck them out the way of the vocal, and this plugin basically does it for you, which I like very much. So we'll turn on that send, and you should hear this.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light, ready to leave it all behind in a city.
So that ducker is really, I've got it flat out, so really we don't get much of a delay at all while the vocal's actually singing, but in the gaps between phrases, the delay really blooms. And that's a neat way of getting a nice sort of, it's almost like a throw, but I haven't had to automate anything. I've just put this particular delay plugin on there. Scooping out a lot of the lows and a lot of the highs. Again, this free plugin doesn't have any kind of EQ or filtering options, so I'm doing that afterwards with the Pro Q3. We can hear what that would be like without.
Swaying in the 4 a.m. light.
Loads of low end there.
Behind in a city. Swaying in the 4 a.m. light. Ready to leave.
Yeah, so we're thinning it out massively. And then, because I wanted quite a lo-fi sound, I'm actually saturating the delay. This is another free plugin, the saturation knob from Softube.
To leave it all behind in
There's a bug with this where the knob doesn't turn. So Softube, if you're watching, it would be great if you could fix that. On the plus side, it means you have to do it by ear, which isn't a bad thing.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Swaying in the foreign
So let's listen to
light.
those in the context of the mix.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Swaying in the foreign light. Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Lost in memory.
So although that vocal was sounding perhaps a little bit bright when we were just listening to it on its own, with those effects softening it and in the context of the mix, I think it's really working. We looked at this whisper last week, just de-essing, saturating and putting all the treble back into that with a reverb thrown straight on the track. So we can have a look at the pre-chorus vocal now. And this is essentially the same chain, but I often mix my vocals on separate tracks for different parts of the song, so that, for example, if the vocalist opens up a bit more in the chorus, which is quite a common thing, I can adjust the compressors so they're not working harder than they need to be. And it just means that I can easily adjust the volume of those parts if the instrumental demands it. I think we'll probably see here that perhaps these compressors are working a little bit harder.
Shift gears, dry tears, in the blink of an eye. Fast lane, clean slate.
So yeah, we are getting a little bit more work out of that 1176 because the vocal is just sung a little bit louder. This one I didn't actually want much delay on, apart from one word. So you can see I've automated a little delay throw off this one word.
In the blink of an eye. Fast lane.
Similarly with the chorus, although nothing's actually changed in the vocal chain, I am just mixing it on another track there. So that's our lead vocal. We can have a quick look at the doubles now, where I'm actually doing no processing at all on the tracks themselves, but they do all come to a vocal bus, this vocal doubles bus, and I've got a few things going on here. So I've got an RVox. I've mentioned this before, but as a simple vocal compressor, I really, really like it. And it's a great low CPU option to throw on buses, or if you've got a lot of different vocal channels that you're trying to compress, you can use it on that.
Shift gears, dry tears.
I'm thinning them out quite a lot.
Fast lane, clean slate.
Because I'm just trying to avoid that sort of low mid build up throughout the whole track.
Shift gears, dry tears.
De-essing with a Soothe.
Shift gears, dry tears.
You can de-ess, or I find I often de-ess, doubles, harmonies, that sort of thing, quite hard. Because you're going to get your S's from your main vocal. I'm using stage 1 here to widen these up. This is a great plugin from Leapwing.
Shift gears, dry tears. Shift gears, dry tears.
If I bypass it,
Shift gears, dry tears. Shift gears, dry tears.
you can hear that throwing it out to the sides, which helps it to fit around the lead vocal. Worth mentioning, these are completely dry. I'm not sending any of these to any effects at all. And the idea is that they just thicken up the lead vocal. We're not trying to go for any sort of particularly fancy choral type effect or gang vocals or anything like that. So if we just listen to the verse before these come in,
Swaying in the foreign light.
it should be quite subtle.
Ready to leave it all behind in a city. Lost in memory.
Almost just thickening and widening the lead.
Hand out trying to hedge a ride. Diamonds on the edge of your eyes. Lines are blurry. Are you with me? Shift gears, dry tears. In the blink of an eye.
And it's important not to go too hard on your doubles if they're not there for the whole track, because otherwise you'll end up, when you get a line with the lead vocal on its own, it suddenly sounds thin and like there's something missing. So it's quite difficult to strike the right balance, I find. And almost all of that work is just on the fader. Just get those doubles to the right level. Harmony time, and you can see I'm going to go through these tracks. There are no inserts on any of these. I do all of this processing on the bus a lot of the time. Sometimes I group things together, and I think I have done a little bit of this later on in this track, but a lot of the time you can just throw it all to a bus, pan it out like we did in the production stage, and on the bus we'll do a bit of processing. So here's our vocal harmonies bus. RVox. compressing that pretty hard. I don't want this to be really, really dynamic. Just a texture, a layer to have behind the vocal. Taking a lot out. I didn't want all that breath because we got so much of that breath and excitement from the lead. The lows. You can hear obviously why I would scoop those out. And there is a gain plugin here, which again is just to allow me the opportunity to automate the volume of those if I needed to.
You keep running from your goal. Do you ever feel like you keep running from your goal? Do you ever feel like you keep running from your ghost? Tomorrow.
Yeah, so it's just
Doesn't need to know.
supporting that lead and allowing as much space for it as possible. Got those oohs there. We're compressing. And pulling out the lows and highs. These oohs I am actually affecting. Now, if we take a quick look in the mixer, here are my oohs, these 4 tracks here, and I group these tracks together. You can see anything I do to one, I do to them all. Now, I could have just done this at the bus, but there are some R's later on that I wanted to treat separately. So I've just scooped out some of the mud here, put a delay on each one and sent them all to the vocal reverb. You can see these are linked as well, so any adjustment that I make to one will be adjusted on the others. And this is also tweaks inside the plugins. So if we just bypass these effects and the sends, that's dry. I'll put in the EQ.
Do you ever feel like you keep running from your ghost? Tomorrow.
Out thinning them out. Now we'll throw in the reverb and the delay.
Do you ever feel like you keep running from your ghost? Tomorrow.
Just sending them to the back there really nicely. We've got a whole nother set of harmonies on this big need to know section and the crazy Jacob Collier choir throw. But on the individual tracks, you can see here, if you look in the left on the inserts, I'm not using anything at all. Some of the later on tracks, I've got one EQ on, but if we just go down to the bus for the need to know harmonies, I'm using Pro Q3 to roll off the lows, a Soothe, which is sidechained from the lead vocal, and a gain plugin, which is giving us that swell. I'm not going to get too far into this big throw because almost all of that was done at the production stage and it didn't really need any further mixing. We can just take a listen to all the vocals on their own.
It doesn't need to know. People here are frozen in time.
Now we're back into the verse.
Doors that lead you back to your mind where the feelings always waiting.
And this is where the guitars start to come in.
Slip away, break the line of sight.
Which we've looked at already.
It's hanging in the air tonight. This is real. Take the wheel. Daylight, take flight. Away from this life. It's out there.
And this is where it might be a good time to look at the automation. So one of the things I'm trying to achieve in this mix in particular is dynamic. Like, it would be very easy to keep things very blocky. So right, here's your verse, here's your pre-chorus, here's your chorus. These things are in this section, these things are in this section. But it's nice to have some movement within those sections. Now, we did a bit of this in the production where, for example, the oohs that we'll look at under the guitar solo, under that final chorus, I chopped some of them out so that they're not present all the time, so they come and go. But you can also have a great time doing this with automation. You could ride a fader, or you could draw in some automation like I did on this guitar part. So if we listen to this arpeggio, you can hear it's panned hard right, but actually the reverb that I'm sending it to is panned hard left. So that's what gives it that really nice sense of being stereo, even though it technically isn't. And I'm automating the gain. Yeah, so I've got the first 2 bars out of every 4, it's quite low, and then it swells for 2 bars, and then it drops down again. And if we listen to that in the mix,
Daylight, take flight, away from this life. It's out there, somewhere. Give it one more try. Daylight.
just helps to keep things moving. And really, when we're getting to the sort of stage where we're automating little things like this, we've got the delay throws that we looked at last week from the ad-libs. You can see the amount of delay.
Tomorrow doesn't need to know.
And just little touches like this, we're pretty much getting there. Now, I did do a bit of Sidechain Soothe work on this on some of the buses. For example, if we look at our synth and guitar bus, we've got this Soothe here, which is sidechained from the vocal, and that's just to give it a little bit more space when there's a lot going on. We've also got a stereo enhancer here, and here's a trick that I like to employ sometimes to give a new section of the song a bit of an impact. You can see if we follow this automation curve, the synths and the guitars are being narrowed slightly as we come out of this final pre-chorus.
It's out there somewhere. Give it one more try. Do you ever feel like you?
And then we blow them slightly wider just to give a subtle bit of extra impact to that final chorus when it arrives. And we're doing something similar with the bass, which is worth a look at. We're opening up the frequency on the filter, which we looked at in the production stage. We're also pulling 2 dBs out of the volume. You can see here, or 1.5, 1.38 dBs. So this tiny little automation here just sucks a little bit of energy out of the bass. That's just volume.
It's out there somewhere.
So when it comes back in, we just feel the impact.
One more try. Do you ever feel like you keep running from your ghost?
Just a nice way to make that final chorus hit a little bit harder. Doing just a little bit on the sub bass as well, exactly the same, dropping down a couple of dBs before we give it all back at the start of this final chorus. And that's pretty much your mix. I'm going to let this play out through the final chorus and outro.
Do you ever feel like you keep running from your ghost? Tomorrow doesn't need to know. Yesterday you gave up, saw the odds and had to fold. But tomorrow doesn't need to know.
One more EQ to enable. Hopefully you heard that sticking out.
Tomorrow doesn't need to know. It doesn't need to know.
That's it for this week. If you found this video helpful, please do like and subscribe for more tips, tricks, resources and downloads from me at Moonshift Audio. Until next time.